The earth did not just speak to Alara Vance. It sang in a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through the soles of her bare feet. Tonight, under the pearlescent gaze of a winter solstice moon, the Whispering Woods were not merely a collection of trees and moss. They were a cathedral, and she was the bell tolling the midnight hour. Terra, Ignis, Aqua, Ventus, Alara murmured, her voice a husk of smoke and velvet. She stood at the center of the clearing, the ancient stone altar cold against the small of her back. Around her, 6 other women formed a loose circle, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hooded linen robes. They were doctors, librarians, and grandmothers by day. By night, under Alara's guidance, they were the keepers of the old ways. The air smelled of crushed sage, damp pine needles, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone, the scent of lightning waiting to strike. Alara raised her arms, the heavy sleeves of her white coat sliding down to reveal forearms dusted with soil and starlight. Her wild, dark curls, usually pinned back in a sensible knot for her shifts at the apothecary, now tumbled freely over her hips, alive with the static charge of the ley lines running beneath them. "We call the light to return," she commanded, her amber eyes reflecting the flickering flames of the ritual fire. "We hold the dark at bay, not with fear, but with balance." As she spoke, the fire did not behave as fire should. It didn't pop or hiss. Instead, the embers detached themselves from the burning oak logs and began to drift upward, floating like lethargic fireflies. They swirled around Alara, drawn to the magnetic pull of her will. She felt the power surge through her, a familiar, intoxicating rush that was half ecstasy, half burden. This was who she was. This was why she had left everything behind 20 years ago, the safety of a normal life, the white picket fence, and the boy who had looked at her as if she hung the moon. She pushed the thought of him away. Regret was a weed. If you didn't pull it by the root, it choked the garden. Tonight required focus. The forest was restless. She could feel an intrusion at the edge of her awareness, a dissonance in the song of the woods. Something rigid, something unyielding, something human. Julian Thorne did not believe in magic. He believed in tensile strength, load-bearing walls, and the uncompromising truth of geometry. He believed in things he could touch, measure, and bill for. What he was doing tramping through the undergrowth of the Whispering Woods at midnight, ruining a pair of $1,200 Italian leather Oxfords, was a question of due diligence. The Whispering Woods were the proposed site for the Thorne Sanctuary, his magnum opus, an eco-resort that would blend seamless modern luxury with the raw, untamed beauty of the Pacific Northwest. The council was hesitant, the locals were superstitious, but Julian had never let a no stop him. He needed to see the topography himself, without a guide, without the orchestrated tour. He pushed aside a heavy branch of hemlock, grimacing as the rough bark snagged the fabric of his charcoal bespoke suit. The silence here was unnatural. In the city, silence was just a pause between noises. Here, it felt heavy, watching him. Then he saw the light. It wasn't a flashlight or the harsh glare of a campsite lantern. It was a soft, pulsating glow filtering through the dense tree line ahead. Julian narrowed his eyes, the slate-gray irises hardening with suspicion. Teenagers, or worse, squatters. He moved forward, his movements disciplined and quiet. He was a man of steel and blueprints, possessing a broad-shouldered physique honed by years of rowing and the sheer force of carrying his empire. He stepped over a rotting log, the scent of wood smoke reaching him. It smelled sweet. Herbal? Marijuana? No, something thicker. Mugwort. When he broke the tree line and saw the clearing, his logical mind stuttered, the gears jamming for a split second. Women in white robes stood in a circle. In the center, a fire burned, but the sparks were wrong. They were floating in a perfect spiral, defying gravity, hovering around a central figure like a localized galaxy. Pyrotechnics, Julian told himself immediately, his jaw tightening. Projectors hidden in the trees, drones. It was an elaborate piece of theater, likely designed to scare off developers. He felt a surge of irritation. He hated inefficiency, and he hated deception. The woman in the center had her back to him. Her hair was a dark, chaotic cascade down her back, moving as if a wind blew only for her. She raised her hands, and the floating lights flared brighter, turning from orange to a blinding chemical violet. "Impressive trick," Julian said, his voice deep and cutting, slicing through the chanting like a scalpel through silk. The chanting cut off instantly. The floating embers didn't fall, they simply vanished, snuffing out as if a switch had been flipped. The women in the circle gasped, retreating into the shadows of the tree line, leaving the central figure alone to face him. Julian stepped fully into the clearing, the moonlight catching the silver streaks at his temples. He radiated authority, the kind that came from boardrooms and skyscrapers. I assume you have a permit for an open fire during a dry season? And for the light show? The woman stood frozen. She didn't turn immediately. He watched the tension line her shoulders beneath the velvet coat. The air around her seemed to shimmer, distorting the view of the trees behind her, though Julian attributed it to the heat of the fire. "You are trespassing," the woman said. Her voice was low, rich, and vibrated in his chest in a way that annoyed him. It sounded like the low hum of a cello string. "On the contrary," Julian countered, stepping closer, ignoring the mud slicking his soles. "I am the prospective owner of this land. You are the ones conducting whatever this pagan theater is. Who is in charge here?" "The land cannot be owned, Julian," she whispered. His name. She had used his name. The shock of it rooted him to the spot. The voice, stripped of the ceremonial command, it held a cadence that clawed at a door in his mind he had welded shut 2 decades ago. A door labeled "Before." The woman turned slowly. The firelight caught the sharp angles of her face, illuminating skin that looked like poured cream and eyes that burned with a terrifying, luminous amber intelligence. She was older now, the softness of girlhood carved away to reveal a breathtaking, formidable woman. Lines of wisdom bracketed her mouth, and there was a heaviness to her gaze that spoke of storms weathered and secrets kept. But it was her. It was the face that had haunted his sketchbooks for years until he finally burned them. "Elara?" The word left his lips more as an exhale than a question. It tasted of ash. Elara Vance stood her ground, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Seeing him was a physical blow. Julian Thorne, the boy who had promised to build her a castle, now the man threatening to tear down her sanctuary. He was magnificent, she hated to admit. Time had treated him with cruel kindness. He was broader, harder. The lanky, poetic boy was gone, replaced by this monolith of a man in a suit that cost more than her car. His eyes, the color of wet slate, swept over her, taking in the bare feet, the ritual garb, the wild hair. "Hello, Julian," she said, tilting her chin up. She refused to cower. She was the high priestess of the Whispering Woods, not the weeping girl who had left a letter on his pillow and run away to find her magic. Julian closed the distance between them, ignoring the heat radiating from the dying fire. He stopped mere inches from her. He smelled of rain, expensive wool, and aggressive, masculine soap. It was a scent devoid of magic, purely, devastatingly human. "You," he ground out, his eyes narrowing as he processed the impossibility of her presence. "You're the impediment? The local guardian the town council warned me about? You're the one blocking my hotel?" "I am protecting the ley lines," Elara said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled beneath her sleeves. "This forest is not a construction site, Julian. It is a living, breathing entity. You cannot pour concrete over its heart." Julian let out a short, harsh laugh. He looked around the clearing, gesturing vaguely at the darkness. "Ley lines, magic. You left me for this, for fairy tales and playing dress-up in the woods?" The insult struck deeper than she expected. He didn't see the power, he didn't feel the hum of the earth. He only saw a woman playing pretend. "It is not a game," she said, her amber eyes flashing. The wind picked up suddenly, whipping her hair across her face and rattling the branches overhead, with a violence that made Julian flinch. "And you have no idea what you are walking into. Leave, Julian, before the woods decide to make you leave." Julian didn't back down. He was a man who bent steel to his will. He wasn't afraid of a breeze. He reached out, his hand closing around her upper arm. His grip was warm, firm, and electric. The moment his skin touched the velvet of her coat, a shock, stronger than static, sharper than a pinprick, zipped between them. They both gasped, pulling back as if burned. Julian stared at his hand, then at her, his expression shifting from anger to a profound, unsettling confusion. For a second, the mask of the ruthless architect slipped, revealing the wounded lover beneath. "I'm buying this land, Elara," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, intimate and threatening. "I'm going to clear this forest. I'm going to build my legacy here, and I'm going to bury the past under 10 feet of foundation." Elara stepped closer, invading his space, her amber eyes locking with his slate ones. The air between them crackled, heavy with 20 years of unsaid words and a chemistry that had only grown more volatile with age. Build your walls, Julian, she challenged softly, the scent of ozone spiking around them as the first drop of rain fell from the clear, moonlit sky to hiss against the fire. But be warned, I don't just know the earth. I am the earth, and I will shake your foundations until they crumble. He stared at her, mesmerized and furious, realizing with a sinking dread that the woman who had broken his heart was the only force of nature he didn't know how to blueprint. Dear listeners, please leave a comment about which city you are listening from and subscribe to the channel in the name of love. This will support me and give me inspiration for new stories. The morning light that filtered into the gilded root was not the harsh, exposing glare of the outside world. Here, filtered through jars of amber resin and emerald-tinted bottles, the sun softened, turning the air into a suspension of gold dust and dried herbs. Alara Vance stood behind the scarred oak counter, the rhythmic shh of her mortar and pestle serving as the only sound in the shop. She was grinding valerian root and chamomile, a blend for Mrs. Gable's insomnia, but her mind was miles away, tangled in the dark woods she was sworn to protect. Or perhaps, if she were being honest, her mind was tangled in the man who wanted to bulldoze them. The scent of the shop usually soothed her, a deep, earthy perfume of dried sage, beeswax, and the sharp, medicinal tang of willow bark. But today, beneath the comfort of the apothecary, her own scent betrayed her anxiety. The ozone smell of an approaching storm clung to her skin despite the clear sky outside. It was the warning signal of a witch whose equilibrium had been threatened. The brass bell above the door didn't just chime. It tolled, a singular, heavy note that vibrated through the floorboards. Alara didn't look up immediately. She felt him before she saw him. The air pressure in the room shifted, growing denser, as if the space itself were contracting to accommodate a massive, immovable object. It smells like the inside of a coffin in here, Alara. The voice was low, rolling over her like a velvet wave, carrying a grit of gravel that hadn't been there 24 years ago. Alara paused, the pestle resting against the ceramic bowl. She took a breath, steeling herself, and looked up. Julian Thorne stood in the doorway, and for a terrifying heartbeat, the years evaporated. He was still the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, though time had carved him into something sharper, harder. At 46, the boyish charm was gone, replaced by a devastating, mature elegance. He wore a charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders with architectural precision, the fabric expensive and severe. But it was his face that held her captive, the strong jaw shadowed with stubble, the silver that now streaked his dark hair at the temples, and those eyes, slate gray, cool, calculating, and utterly devoid of the magic he refused to believe in. "It smells like life, Julian," Alara corrected, her voice steady, though her pulse hammered a traitorous rhythm against her throat. "Roots, soil, healing. But I suppose to a man who prefers concrete and steel, anything organic must smell like decay." Julian stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He moved with a prowling confidence, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the uneven wooden floorboards. He looked out of place among the hanging bundles of drying lavender and the shelves of strange curiosities, a wolf in a bespoke suit wandering through a garden. "I prefer things that last," he countered, walking to a shelf and picking up a small jar of rosemary oil. He examined the handwritten label with a critical eye. "Concrete endures. Steel supports. This," he gestured vaguely at the shop. "This is quaint, Alara, but it's dust." "Dust is what we come from, and dust is what we return to," she said, wiping her hands on her velvet coat. It was a deep moss green, embroidered with silver thread at the cuffs, a subtle armor. "Why are you here, Julian? If you've come to buy a salve for a guilty conscience, I'm afraid I'm fresh out of stock." Julian set the jar down with a deliberate clink. He turned to face her fully, leaning his hip against a display of crystal geodes. The casual posture didn't fool her. She could see the tension in the line of his neck, the way his fingers flexed at his side. "I'm here to save you from yourself," he said, his tone shifting from mockery to a frustratingly sincere pragmatism. "I saw the way you looked at the plans last night. I saw the fire in your eyes. But emotion doesn't pay the town's bills, Alara. Heritage doesn't fix the potholes on Main Street or keep the school open. And a luxury hotel in the heart of the Blackwood Forest will." Alara moved around the counter, needing to put less wood and more air between them. Or perhaps, dangerously, she wanted to be closer. "You're talking about tearing down trees that have stood since the founding of this country. You're talking about disturbing the..." She stopped herself. She couldn't say ley lines. She couldn't say ancient wards. To Julian, those were fairy tales. Disturbing the what? Julian pushed, his eyes narrowing. The squirrels, the moss. Alara, be reasonable. I'm offering a compromise. We keep the oldest grove intact. We build around the stream. It will be respectful, elegant. I designed it myself. I know you did, she said softly. I recognize your lines. Cold, perfect, soulless. The insult landed. She saw a muscle twitch in his cheek. He pushed off the display table and took 2 long strides toward her, invading her personal space. The scent of him hit her then. Sandalwood, expensive leather, and the crisp, sterile smell of blueprints. It was intoxicating and infuriating in equal measure. Soulless? He repeated, his voice dropping to a husky murmur that made her knees weak. Is that what you think I am? Because I walked away? Because I wanted to build something real instead of playing make-believe in the woods with you? You didn't just walk away, Julian. You ran, and you didn't just want to build. You wanted to pave over everything that made you feel something you couldn't explain. Alara tilted her chin up, meeting his gaze. Her amber eyes swirled with gold flecks, a silent warning. You hate the forest because it's the one thing you can't control. You can't blueprint a root system. You can't draft the wind. I am trying to help you, he snapped, the facade of the cool architect cracking to reveal the passionate man beneath. The town council is going to approve the sale whether you protest or not. If I am the developer, I can protect your shop. I can ensure the apothecary stays. If it's someone else, they'll evict you and turn this place into a parking lot. Alara let out a bitter laugh. So you're my savior? The white knight in a tailored suit here to rescue the poor, delusional spinster witch? I never called you a witch, he said, frustration vibrating in his chest. I called you eccentric. There is a difference. Not to me. She turned her back on him, reaching for a jar of dried nettles on a high shelf, her fingers trembling. She couldn't look at him anymore. The nostalgia was a physical ache, a tightening in her chest that felt like vines constricting her heart. She remembered his hands on her waist under the harvest moon 20 years ago. She remembered him promising he would never leave. Ilara, look at me, he commanded. She ignored him, stretching for the jar. Ilara. Go away, Julian. Take your blueprints and your charity and leave my shop. He didn't leave. Instead, she heard the sharp intake of his breath, the rustle of fabric, and then he was right behind her. He reached out, his large, warm hand encircling her wrist to stop her from pulling away, to force her to turn around. I am not leaving until we... The moment his skin touched hers, the world dissolved into white noise. It wasn't just a static shock. It was a collision of opposing atmospheric fronts. Alara gasped as a jolt of raw, unadulterated energy surged up her arm, hot and electric. It slammed into Julian with the force of a physical blow. The air in the shop instantly ionized, smelling sharply of a lightning strike. Pop! Above them, the vintage filament bulb in the overhead pendant light exploded. A shower of fine glass rained down, tinkling against the floorboards and the counter. The room plunged into sudden shadow, lit only by the dusty daylight from the window. Julian jerked his hand back as if he'd been burned, stumbling a step backward. He stared at his own palm, then at her, his slate eyes wide with genuine shock. He rubbed his fingertips together, wincing. What the hell was that? He demanded, his voice ragged. Alara clutched her own wrist, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her skin was tingling, humming with the resonance of the ley lines that ran beneath the floorboards. They were waking up. They were reacting to him. Or rather, they were reacting to the friction between the two of them, the immovable object and the unstoppable force. She looked at him, seeing the confusion warring with his logic. He was searching for a reason. He was looking for the wires. Static, she lied, though her voice shook. Old wool coat. Dry air. Julian looked up at the shattered light fixture, swinging gently on its chain. Static doesn't blow out industrial light fixtures, Alara. That was a surge. You have faulty wiring. This place is a fire hazard. He was retreating into his fortress of logic. He was building walls again, right before her eyes. He couldn't accept that the spark between them was strong enough to break glass. The wiring is fine, she whispered, stepping over the broken glass, her boots crunching softly. She needed him to leave. Now, before the jars started shaking, before the shadows in the corners started to reach for him. It's old, Julian. Like me. Sometimes things just break under pressure. Julian stared at her for a long moment, the silence thick and charged. He looked at the glass on the floor, then back to her face. For a fleeting second, the skeptic vanished, and she saw the boy who had once believed in her magic. He looked terrified. "Fix the wiring, Alara," he said, his voice tight, barely controlled. "I don't want you burning down before I have the chance to save you." He turned on his heel and walked out, the bell tolling his departure. Alara stood alone in the dim shop, the scent of ozone now overwhelming the lavender. She looked down at her wrist where he had touched her. A faint, red mark bloomed there, not a burn, but a brand. As she watched, the small fern on the counter, the one that had been struggling to survive for months, unfurled a vibrant, new green frond, growing an inch in seconds. Alara touched the leaf, her hand shaking. Julian could deny it all he wanted. He could hide behind his blueprints and his skepticism. But the earth knew better. He wasn't just disrupting the energy, he was amplifying it. The mortar and pestle made a rhythmic, grinding sound, the friction between stone and stone echoing the tension tightening Alara's chest. She was pulverizing dried mugwort and dragon's blood resin, a combination intended for protection, though she feared it would do little against the man who had invaded her sanctuary with a briefcase full of blueprints. Outside, the twilight was deepening into a bruised purple, the heavy velvet curtain of night descending upon the forest. The shop was closed. The open sign flipped, yet the bell above the door chimed. A singular, sharp note that cut through the scent of drying sage. Alara didn't look up. She knew the cadence of those footsteps, heavy, deliberate, expensive. Leather soles on hardwood, moving with the arrogance of a man who assumed the world would align itself to his stride. "The door was locked, Julian," she said, her voice low, keeping her gaze on the dark powder in her bowl. "Locks are mechanical mechanisms, Alara. Mechanics can be bypassed." She finally lifted her eyes. Julian Thorne stood in the center of her eclectic shop, a monolith of charcoal wool and starch amidst the hanging bundles of rosemary and the shelves of glittering crystals. At 46, he was more striking than the boy who had once carved their initials into the weeping willow by the creek. Time had been an artist with him, sharpening the jawline, silvering the temples of his dark hair, and turning his slate-gray eyes into something impenetrable. He placed a thick document on the counter, right beside a jar of pickled newt eyes. Actually pearl onions, but he didn't need to know that. The contrast was jarring, the pristine white legal paper against the scarred, ancient oak of her workspace. "I'm not signing it," she said. "You haven't read it?" Julian countered, unbuttoning his suit jacket as he leaned forward. The movement brought the scent of him, sandalwood, crisp linen, and the cold metallic tang of the city, crashing into her herbal atmosphere. "I've revised the terms. The cottage remains yours, in perpetuity. I'll even pay for the restoration of the roof and the foundation work." Alara wiped her hands on her velvet coat, the crushed velvet deep green like moss. "And in exchange? The forest. The 40 acres surrounding this property." He tapped the paper with a manicured finger. "I need the land, Alara. My investors are growing impatient. The boutique resort I've designed, it's not just a hotel. It's a masterpiece. Organic architecture. Falling water meets the 21st century. You want to pour concrete over ley lines, Julian? You want to put a parking structure where the earth breathes?" He let out a short, frustrated breath, running a hand through his hair. "There you go again. Ley lines. Breathing earth. You sound like a pamphlet for a Renaissance fair. Listen to me." His voice dropped, shifting from negotiation to something more intimate, more dangerous. "You are sitting on a gold mine, and you're living like a pauper. The wiring in here is a fire hazard. The wood is rotting. Let me help you. Let me build you a life that doesn't involve selling herbal tea to tourists." Alara felt a spark of anger ignite in her belly, hot and sudden. It wasn't just his dismissal of her craft. It was the assumption that she needed saving, that his steel and glass were superior to her roots and bone. She moved around the counter, closing the distance between them. She saw his eyes widen slightly, tracking the sway of her hips, the way her wild curls caught the candlelight. She knew she unsettled him. "Good. You think you know this land," she said softly, stopping toe-to-toe with him. She had to crane her neck slightly to meet his gaze. "You think it's just measurements and topography, elevation grades and soil density?" "That is exactly what it is," he insisted, though he didn't step back. "Prove it." Julian blinked. "Excuse me?" "Walk with me. 1 hour. Tonight. Alara gestured toward the back door that led directly into the densest part of the woods. If you can walk through the heart of the grove and tell me, honestly, that it's just dirt and timber, I'll look at your contract. I'll consider it. Julian studied her face, his gaze searching for the trap. He was a man of logic, but he wasn't a fool. He knew Alara Vance. He knew she didn't gamble unless she controlled the dice. It's pitch black out there, he said. The moon is nearly full. Are you afraid of the dark, Julian? You weren't when we were 17. The challenge hung in the air, vibrating. The memory of 17, of fumbling hands, heated breath, and promises made in the very woods he now wanted to bulldoze, flashed in his eyes. He tightened his jaw. Fine, he clipped out. 1 hour. Keep your coat on. The temperature is dropping. Alara grabbed her lantern, though she didn't light it yet. She led him out the back, leaving the safety of the shop behind. The transition was instant. The air here was cooler, heavy with the moisture of the looming night and the smell of wet decay and vibrant growth. As they stepped onto the narrow deer path, Alara reached out with her senses, casting a wide, silent net. Sleep, she commanded the forest. Hush. She needed the woods to be beautiful, yes, but she needed them to be subtle. If a tree root decided to animate and caress Julian's ankle, or if the pixies started their chaotic giggling, he would retreat into his shell of skepticism. Or worse, he'd bring in scientists. She needed him to feel the magic without seeing the machinery of it. Watch your step, she murmured. These roots are jealous of anything that moves too quickly. Julian grunted, his Italian leather shoes slipping slightly on a patch of damp moss. This is ridiculous, Alara. Look at this terrain. It's uneven, unmanaged. A boardwalk system here would actually preserve the ecosystem better than you stomping through it. I don't stomp, I negotiate. She led him deeper, past the twisted hawthorns that looked like old men hunched in prayer. Alara subtly flicked her fingers, and a low-hanging branch that would have slapped Julian's face swung gently upward, as if caught by a breeze. He didn't notice. So, he said, his voice cutting through the chirping of crickets. Why did you come back after college? You had offers. You were brilliant, Alara. You could have been anything. I am everything I want to be. She stopped by a massive oak, its trunk wide enough to hide a car. She placed a hand on the bark, feeling the slow, thrumming pulse of the sap within. Why did you leave? You used to say this town was the only place you could hear yourself think. Julian stopped beside her. He looked out of place, a sleek, modern sculpture dropped into a primordial painting. I realized that thinking wasn't enough. I wanted to build. This town, it suffocates ambition. It wraps vines around your ankles and pulls you into the dirt. Is that what you think I am? Stuck in the dirt? He turned to her, and in the moonlight filtering through the canopy, the harsh lines of his face softened. I think you're hiding. You're protecting a legacy that doesn't care about you back. You're alone in a rotting cottage talking to plants. I am never alone, Alara whispered. A small glowing orb, a will-o'-the-wisp, drifted too close to Julian's shoulder. With a sharp intake of breath, Alara masked it, making it appear as nothing more than a drifting moth catching the moonlight. She stepped closer to him, effectively blocking his view of the creature. The proximity was sudden. She was close enough to see the silver threading through his beard stubble, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his broad chest. The skepticism in his eyes warred with something else, a hunger that had nothing to do with real estate. You're cold, he noted, his voice dropping an octave. I'm fine. You're shivering. Without asking, he shrugged off his suit jacket. The silk lining was warm from his body. He draped it over her shoulders, and for a moment, his hands lingered on her upper arms. His touch was heavy, grounding. It wasn't electric like her magic. It was solid, like the mortar he loved so much. Alara looked up at him, her amber eyes wide. The jacket smelled entirely of him, expensive cologne and the underlying masculine scent of a man who worked himself to exhaustion. Julian, she breathed. The structure of this place, he murmured, looking past her, though his hands stayed on her arms. The way the light hits that ridge. I don't want to destroy it, Alara. I want to frame it. I want people to stand right here and feel what I'm feeling. And what are you feeling? She asked, the question dangerous. He looked down at her then. The architect, the man of steel and plans, looked momentarily lost. Unbalanced, he admitted. Since I came back. Since I walked into your shop. Nothing sits plumb. Maybe you're just standing on slanted ground. Or maybe you're tilting the world. His thumb brushed the velvet of her coat, finding the skin of her neck beneath. The contact sent a jolt through her that the earth amplified. The wind suddenly picked up, swirling the fallen leaves around their feet in a tight, unnatural cyclone. The trees groaned above them, a sound like a chorus of deep cellos. Julian tensed, his eyes darting to the canopy. The wind, it changed instantly. It happens, she said quickly, placing her hands on his chest to steady him, and perhaps to steady the forest. Calm down, she projected into the soil. Not now. But the forest was enjoying the show. It liked the energy Julian brought, the friction of his disbelief rubbing against the reality of the magic. It wanted to play. It's beautiful, Julian whispered, his gaze returning to hers, intense and searching. You, the woods, it's all maddeningly beautiful. He leaned in. The movement was slow, a question rather than a demand. Alara knew she should pull away. She was the guardian. He was the invader. But the pull of history, the gravity of the years they had lost, was stronger than her logic. She tilted her head back, her lips parting slightly. He was going to kiss her. The man who wanted to pave paradise was going to kiss her, and she was going to let him. His breath ghosted over her lips. Ilara, crack. The sound was deafening, like a gunshot, but deeper. The sound of wood snapping under immense pressure. Julian flinched, instinctively curling his body around hers to shield her as the ground beneath them shuddered violently. What the hell was that? Julian shouted over the sudden roar of wind. Alara pushed out of his embrace, her heart hammering against her ribs. She spun around, her eyes scanning the darkness. That wasn't the wind. That wasn't a natural fall. 10 yards away, the earth had split open. Not a fissure, but a heave. Thick, gnarled roots from the ancient oak she had touched moments ago had burst through the surface, writhing like snakes in the moonlight. They weren't just moving, they were reaching, and they were wrapped tight around something that gleamed white in the darkness. Julian stepped up beside her, shining the flashlight from his phone into the chaos of dirt and wood. The beam cut through the dark and landed on the object the roots had unearthed. It was a skull, human, bleached white, and caught in the crushing grip of the oak. Julian went rigid, his architect's brain trying to process the impossibility of the motion, the violence of the upheaval. Did that tree just move? Alara didn't answer. She couldn't. She stared at the skull, feeling a cold dread wash over her that had nothing to do with the temperature. She recognized the energy radiating from the bone. It wasn't random. The forest hadn't just reacted to Julian's presence. It had answered a question she hadn't dared to ask. The roots tightened, the sound of dry bone cracking echoing through the clearing. Julian grabbed her hand, his grip crushing, his voice losing all its smooth boardroom confidence. Ilara, he rasped, pulling her back as the roots thrashed again, tearing up more earth, widening the hole. We need to go, now. But Alara stood frozen, watching as the roots lifted the skull high into the moonlight, forcing them to bear witness to a secret the forest had kept buried for 20 years. The sky didn't just open, it shattered. One moment, the moonlight had been illuminating the horrific tableau of the unearthed skull. The next, a wall of water slammed into the earth with the force of a falling ocean. It was a torrential, unnatural squall, the kind that smelled of bruised ozone and ancient, awakened temper. Julian yanked Alara's arm, his grip fierce enough to bruise, snapping her out of her trance. Move, Alara! We can't stay here! Thunder detonated directly overhead, a physical blow that rattled Alara's teeth. She stumbled, her velvet boots sliding on the sudden mire of mud and pine needles. The forest was screaming. She could feel it vibrating through the soles of her feet, a chaotic, defensive hum that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with the ley lines Julian's surveying equipment had disturbed. The ridge! She shouted over the roar of the wind, her hair whipping across her face like a dark, wet veil. There's a cutter's cabin just past the rise. It's old, but the roof is slate. Julian didn't argue. He wrapped an arm around her waist, shielding her with the bulk of his body against the stinging rain. He moved with a grim, efficient determination, his bespoke suit instantly ruined, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the muck. He was a man fighting the elements, unaware he was actually fighting a sentient mood swing of nature itself. They scrambled up the incline, the mud slick as oil. Alara felt the briars snatching at her coat, whispering warnings against her skin. Intruder, threat, Ironheart. She pushed the voices away, focusing on the heat radiating from Julian. He felt solid, real, an anchor of logic in a world that was rapidly unspooling into chaos. The cabin materialized out of the deluge like a ghost, a squat structure of gray stone and timber huddled beneath the weeping boughs of a massive hemlock. The door hung crookedly on rusted hinges. Julian threw his shoulder against it, and the wood groaned in protest before giving way. They tumbled inside, the darkness instantaneous and total. Julian kicked the door shut behind them, fighting the wind for control, until the latch caught with a heavy clunk. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by their ragged breathing and the relentless drumming of the rain on the slate roof. Jesus, Julian exhaled, the words shaking slightly. He leaned back against the door, water streaming from his silver-streaked hair, plastering the fine charcoal wool of his jacket to his chest. I've seen storms in the tropics that didn't hit that fast. It came out of nowhere. Not nowhere, Alara thought, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It came from the roots. Mountain weather, she said aloud, her voice trembling. It's unpredictable. She wrapped her arms around herself. The temperature had plummeted 20 degrees in as many seconds. The damp cold of the unsealed cabin began to seep into her bones, warring with the lingering adrenaline. It smelled of dry rot, abandoned spiderwebs, and the metallic tang of the storm outside. Julian pushed off the door, his slate-gray eyes adjusting to the gloom. You're shaking. I'm fine, she lied, her teeth chattering. You're freezing and you're lying. Two things haven't changed in 20 years. He moved toward her, shedding his sodden jacket. Underneath, his white dress shirt was translucent with rain, clinging to the broad expanse of his shoulders and the defined muscles of his chest. We need to get you dry, or at least warmer. Is there a fireplace? In the corner, Alara gestured vaguely. But the wood will be damp. Julian knelt by the hearth, peering into the gloom. There was a stack of logs, ancient and covered in a layer of dust, alongside some brittle kindling. It's dry enough, he assessed, his voice shifting into that familiar, authoritative timbre that used to drive her mad with desire in high school. I have a lighter. He flicked the gold Zippo. The flame was a tiny, brave struggle against the encroaching dark. As he arranged the kindling with architecturally precise hands, Alara reached into the deep pocket of her coat. Her fingers brushed the sachet of dried mugwort and sage she always carried. With a subtle flick of her wrist, invisible in the shadows, she crumbled a pinch of the herbs toward the hearth. Burn bright, burn dry, chase the chill from the winter sky. The intent was a silent whisper in her mind. When Julian touched the flame to the wood, it didn't smoke or sputter. It roared to life with an eager, golden intensity that made Julian blink. Lucky, he muttered, warming his hands. Draft must be good. The firelight washed the room in flickering amber, transforming the derelict shack into something intimate. It cast long, dancing shadows against the walls and highlighted the sharp, aristocratic lines of Julian's face. He turned to her, and the breath hitched in Alara's throat. He was beautiful in a way that hurt, a mix of the boy she had loved and the formidable man he had become. Come here, he commanded softly. Get closer to the heat. Alara moved toward the fire, shedding her heavy, waterlogged velvet coat. She let it drop to the floor, leaving her in a thin, silk blouse that offered no secrets. The rain had soaked through it, making the fabric cling to the curve of her breasts and the dip of her waist. She saw Julian's gaze drop, travel over her, and then snap back to her eyes. His jaw tightened. Turn around, he said, his voice rougher now. Your hair's dripping down your back. She obeyed, turning her back to him as she sat on the dusty floorboards near the hearth. She felt him move behind her. His presence was a palpable weight, a heat source that rivaled the fire. May I? He asked. The question was a courtesy. The air between them was already charged with a permission that predated this night. Yes. His hands touched her shoulders, warm and large. He began to wring the water from her long, dark curls, his movements methodical, yet surprisingly gentle. The sensation of his fingers brushing the nape of her neck sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core, sharper than the storm's lightning. That skull, Alara, he said quietly, his hands working through the heavy mass of her hair. The way those roots moved. I build skyscrapers. I know how load-bearing structures work. I know how soil mechanics work. That wasn't natural. Alara closed her eyes, leaning slightly back into his touch, fighting the urge to tell him everything. The forest is old, Julian, old. The soil shifts. Erosion can do strange things. Don't give me the park ranger speech, he murmured, his hand sliding down to her upper arms, rubbing briskly to generate friction and warmth. I saw what I saw. It looked like the earth was spitting it out. Maybe it was, she whispered. Maybe the earth is tired of holding secrets. Julian went still. His hand stopped moving, resting heavy and hot on her shoulders. The silence stretched, thick with unsaid words and the crackle of the unnatural fire. Is that what we're doing? He asked, his voice dropping to a gravelly low. Holding secrets? Alara turned, shifting on the floorboards, so she faced him. They were inches apart, huddled in the small sphere of firelight while the storm raged against the walls. He looked exhausted, his hair disheveled, droplets of water running down his temples. But his eyes, slate gray and piercing, were utterly focused on her. I don't know what you mean, she deflected, though her pulse betrayed her, fluttering visibly at the base of her throat. I came back to build a hotel, Julian said, his gaze searching her face. That's the logic, that's the business plan. But when I saw your name on the opposition paperwork, when I saw you standing in the town square last week, he hesitated, a crack in his steel armor. I didn't take the contract for the land, Alara. I took it because I knew it would force me to see you. Alara's breath caught. Julian. I have a penthouse in London and a villa in Tuscany, he continued, lifting a hand to brush a damp curl away from her cheek. His knuckles grazed her skin, rough and electric. And yet, the only place I've ever felt like I wasn't just performing was in the passenger seat of your rusted Ford Escort when we were 17. The confession hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Alara felt tears prick her eyes. He was a man of concrete and glass, yet he was offering her something fragile. We were children, she whispered, leaning into his hand involuntarily. The scent of him, expensive sandalwood, rain, and warm male skin, filled her senses, intoxicating her. We aren't children now. He leaned in. The movement was slow, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She couldn't. The pull was magnetic, a force of nature as undeniable as the tides. She parted her lips, her gaze dropping to his mouth, remembering the taste of him from a lifetime ago. Julian's hand cupped her jaw, his thumb tracing her lower lip. The friction was agonizingly sweet. Alara, he breathed, tilting his head. The gap closed. Their breath mingled, hot and frantic. Just as his lips brushed hers, a sudden, violent crack of thunder shook the cabin, vibrating through the floorboards. Alara gasped, her hand flying up to clutch at her chest, her fingers splaying over her collarbone. In her shock, and with her emotional barriers lowered by the intimacy, her control slipped. The protection rune she had inked into her skin with elderberry juice and intention, hidden beneath a glamour for years, flared to life. It was a soft reactive pulse, a defensive mechanism triggered by the storm's aggression. For a fleeting second, a complex, interlaced symbol glowed with a pale, bioluminescent amber light against her skin, right where the top button of her blouse had come undone. Julian froze. He didn't kiss her. Instead, he pulled back sharply, his eyes widening. Alara scrambled to pull her blouse together, panic dousing the passion in an instant. Julian, wait! He grabbed her wrist, not painfully, but with the immovable force of a man who needed answers. He stared at her collarbone. The light had faded, but he had seen it. He was a man who dealt in blueprints, in things that could be measured and explained. He knew light didn't just happen on human skin. What was that? His voice was no longer soft. The seduction was gone, replaced by the sharp edge of the skeptic confronting the impossible. It was nothing, Alara stammered, trying to pull her hand away. A reflection of the fire, the lightning. The fire is behind you, Julian said, his voice flat, terrifyingly logical. And the lightning is outside. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, Alara saw fear in his slate eyes. Not fear of the storm, but fear of the woman he had just been about to kiss. Show me, he demanded, reaching for the collar of her shirt. No. She scrambled backward, hitting the rough stones of the hearth. Julian stood up, towering over her, his silhouette framed by the dying fire. The intimacy of the moment had shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Alara, your skin. It glowed. It wasn't a trick. It was a mark. He took a step back, putting distance between them, his expression hardening into suspicion. The warmth was gone from the room. Who are you? He whispered, the sound cutting through the noise of the rain. Because the woman I knew, didn't have secrets written in light on her body? The question hung in the damp air between them, heavier than the thunder rattling the window panes. Who are you? Alara stared up at Julian, her chest heaving with the effort to contain the energy surging beneath her skin. The mark of the weaver on her collarbone was cooling, fading back into invisible dormancy, but the damage was done. Julian, the man of steel beams and concrete certainties, had seen the impossible. I am the same woman you took to the homecoming dance, Julian, she said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a sudden, reckless exhaustion. I am Alara. Just Alara. No. Julian shook his head, the silver streaks in his charcoal hair catching the low light of the embers. He looked devastatingly tired, the lines around his slate eyes deepening. That girl didn't hum with electricity. That girl didn't make the air taste like ozone and burnt sage just by walking into a room. You're hiding something. You've been hiding it since I came back to town. He moved closer, invading her personal space with the sheer gravitational pull of his presence. He smelled of rain-soaked wool, expensive cologne, and the terrifyingly masculine scent of a man pushed to his limit. Is it the land? Is that why you won't sell? Is there something in the soil that does this to you? Logic. Always logic. He was trying to build a framework for the inexplicable. It isn't the soil, Julian. It's the soul, she whispered. The storm outside reached a crescendo, a crack of thunder so loud it felt as though the sky had split open directly above the small cabin. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into a darkness alleviated only by the dying hearth fire. In the sudden dark, the tension between them snapped. The fear in Julian's eyes transmuted instantly into something darker, hungrier. The adrenaline of the near miss with the lightning and the confusing rush of the confrontation boiled over. He reached out, his large, warm hands cupping her face. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was a claim. Stop lying to me, he growled, his mouth inches from hers. For 1 second, Alara, stop fighting me. I'm not fighting you, she breathed, the amber light of her eyes wide and luminous in the shadows. I'm fighting for you. He didn't wait for an explanation. He crushed his mouth to hers, swallowing her protest. It was a kiss of 20 years of silence, a collision of his rigid control and her wild, untamed nature. Alara gasped, her hands instinctively clutching the lapels of his damp suit jacket, pulling him down to her level. Julian groaned, a low vibration against her lips, and the sound shattered her resolve. She forgot the secrets. She forgot the forest that demanded her protection and the hotel he threatened to build upon its bones. There was only this, the man who had been her first love, now returned as a silver fox with broad shoulders and a mouth that tasted of rain and desire. He walked her backward, his movements fluid and dominant, until her legs hit the edge of the velvet sofa. They collapsed onto it, a tangle of limbs and urgent hands. The air in the cabin grew thick, charged not just with the storm outside, but with the ancient, potent magic of connection. Julian, she sighed, his name a prayer and a curse on her tongue as his hands swept down her body, learning the curves that had softened and deepened over the last 2 decades. He touched her with a reverence that made her heart ache, his calloused fingertips tracing the line of her throat. You feel real, he murmured against her skin, unbuttoning her blouse with dexterous, trembling fingers. You feel heated, like fire. She helped him out of his jacket, stripping away the armor of the wealthy architect to reveal the man beneath. His shirt followed, buttons popping and scattering across the floor like hail. When skin met skin, Alara felt a jolt of power that had nothing to do with witchcraft. It was the grounding force of him, his earth to her air. He was solid, immovable, and undeniably human. Their lovemaking was a storm of its own. It wasn't the tentative exploration of their youth. It was the desperate, consuming passion of 2 people who knew the weight of loss. Julian moved with a disciplined intensity, his muscles coiled and taut, driving into her with a rhythm that sought to anchor her chaos. Alara wrapped her legs around his waist, her back arching, her wild curls spilling over the armrest like dark water. For a while there was no magic, no covens, no blueprints. There was only the friction of bodies, the scent of musk and sage, and the sound of their ragged breathing mixing with the rain. When release finally claimed them, it was a mutual surrender, leaving them breathless and entangled in the flickering firelight. Silence returned to the cabin, heavy and languid. Julian rolled onto his back, pulling Alara against his side. He draped a heavy throw blanket over them, his chest rising and falling like a bellows. Alara rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the steady, reassuring thrum of his heart. She felt a profound sadness settle over her. This intimacy was a borrowed thing. Morning would come, and with it, his bulldozers and her duty. "Alara," he said softly, his voice raspy. He stared up at the wooden beams of the ceiling. "I don't know what happened earlier. The light on your skin. Maybe it was a reflection. Maybe I'm just exhausted." She closed her eyes, guilt pooling in her stomach. "Maybe," she lied. He shifted, sitting up slightly to reach for his discarded trousers, presumably to find his watch or phone. As he moved, his foot knocked against Alara's leather satchel, which had been discarded near the hearth. The bag tipped over, spilling its contents across the braided rug. Dried bundles of mugwort and rowan tumbled out, followed by a heavy, leather-bound book. The book hit the floor with a thud that sounded far too loud in the quiet room. It fell open to the center pages. Julian froze. He looked down. It was not a sketchbook. It was not a diary. The pages were thick parchment, covered in complex, hand-inked botanical illustrations that seemed to writhe in the firelight. But it was the text that caught the eye. Latin mixed with Gaelic, surrounding intricate geometric sigils that defied architectural geometry. Alara sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest, panic spiking in her blood. "Julian, don't!" He reached down and picked up the grimoire. His architect's eyes scanned the open page. He read the heading, written in Alara's distinct, looping hand, "For the binding of earth and the silencing of stone." "What is this?" His voice had lost its postcoital warmth. It was back to steel. He looked at the dried herbs scattered on the rug, things that looked less like potpourri and more like ingredients. "Binding of earth. Alara, this looks like..." He looked at her, and the softness was gone from his face. "Is this some kind of joke? A local superstition you're peddling to scare off developers?" "It's my family's history," she said, her voice tight. "Put it down, Julian, please. You're fighting a multi-million-dollar hotel project with geese, dried weeds, and fairy tales?" He stood up, the blanket falling away from his waist, unashamed of his nudity, clutching the book like evidence in a trial. "I thought you were protecting an ecosystem, but you're protecting a fantasy." Before she could answer, a low, guttural groan emanated from the earth beneath the cabin. It wasn't thunder, it was deeper, a vibration that rattled Alara's teeth and made the cast-iron poker fall against the hearth with a clang. Julian staggered, gripping the mantel for support. "What the hell was that?" Alara scrambled off the sofa, grabbing her silk robe and throwing it on. She could feel it, the screaming of the ley lines. Julian's presence here, his intrusion into the heart of the woods, and his intent to pave over the sacred grove had agitated the dormant energies already whipped into a frenzy by the storm. "The land," Alara gasped, her eyes widening. "It's rejecting you." "Don't be ridiculous," Julian snapped, though he looked at the floorboards as if expecting them to buckle. "It's a mudslide. The rain has loosened the slope." A terrifying roar tore through the night, drowning out his logic. Above the cabin, the ancient hillside, saturated with rain and malice, gave way. "Julian, move!" Alara screamed. The back wall of the cabin splintered inward. Mud, rocks, and the trunk of a massive pine tree smashed through the wood and stone as if they were paper. The violence was deafening. Julian turned, his eyes wide, but he was too slow. The structural integrity of the cabin failed. The heavy oak main beam of the ceiling snapped with the sound of a gunshot, plummeting directly toward where Julian stood frozen, the grimoire still in his hand. There was no time for herbs, no time for rituals, no time to hide. Alara screamed, thrusting her hand forward, palm open. "Stop!" The air in the room condensed, turning solid. The pressure dropped so sharply her ears popped. The falling oak beam, weighing hundreds of pounds, slammed to a halt 3 feet above Julian's head. It didn't bounce. It didn't swing. It simply stopped, suspended in midair as if held by an invisible, giant hand. Dust motes swirled around the floating timber. The roar of the landslide ceased as abruptly as it had begun, held back by a shimmering, translucent wall of force that Alara projected with every ounce of her will. Silence, absolute and terrifying, filled the room. Alara stood trembling, her arm extended, her fingers curled like claws. Her eyes were no longer just amber. They were glowing with a fierce, internal golden fire. Her hair floated around her face, lifted by the static charge pouring off her body. Julian slowly looked up at the beam, hovering impossibly above him. He saw the splintered wood, the deadly weight of it defying gravity. He saw the dust hanging suspended in the air. Then he looked at her. Alara panted, sweat beading on her forehead, holding the weight of the house and the hill with her mind. She couldn't speak. She couldn't deny it. She was unveiled. Julian's face went pale, draining of all color. The grimoire slipped from his fingers and hit the floor. "Alara?" he whispered, the name fracturing in his throat. With a flick of her wrist, she shoved the beam sideways, crashing it harmlessly against the far wall, and let the invisible shield drop. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. Julian didn't rush to help her. He backed away, his back hitting the only wall that remained intact. He looked at her not with the passion of a lover, nor the skepticism of an architect. He looked at her like she was a monster. The word hung in the dusty, fractured air between them, heavier than the timber she had just cast aside. Monster. It wasn't spoken, but it was written in the dilation of his slate-colored eyes, in the way his bespoke jacket strained as he pressed his spine against the plaster, retreating from the woman he had kissed only hours ago under the weeping willows. Alara lowered her hand. The amber glow in her irises dimmed, leaving her exhausted, her chest heaving beneath her velvet coat. The scent of ozone, sharp and metallic, like a storm trapped indoors, radiated from her skin, overpowering the dry dust of the crumbling cottage. "Julian," she rasped, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "Please, you have to listen." "What are you?" Julian's voice was steady, terrifyingly calm, the tone he used when a contractor failed to meet code. But his hands were trembling. The man of blueprints and steel, who believed in load-bearing walls and tensile strength, had just watched the laws of physics shatter. Before Alara could bridge the distance, the ground beneath them gave a violent, sickening lurch. It wasn't the settling of an old house. It was a deep, subterranean roar, the sound of the mountain grinding its teeth. The surviving windows blew out, showering the floor with diamonds of glass. The cottage groaned, the timber frame screaming as the earth beneath the foundation began to liquefy. The construction, Julian's hotel site further up the ridge, had severed a ley line, and the mountain was no longer asking for respect. It was demanding it. "The slide!" Alara gasped, clutching her stomach as nausea rolled through her. She could feel the agony of the roots deep below. "The earth is shearing. If it goes, it takes the town below. It takes us." Julian looked at the ceiling, where fine cracks were spiderwebbing across the plaster. Logic returned to him in a rush of adrenaline. He didn't understand the magic, but he understood structural failure. "We need to get to the door. Now, Alara!" "No!" She planted her feet, though her knees shook. "I can't outrun the mountain, Julian. I have to bind it." "Bind it?" He surged forward, grabbing her shoulders. His touch was electric, scorching hot against her cooling skin. "You can barely stand. You're bleeding." She reached up, her fingers grazing the silver stubble on his jaw. He flinched, then held still. "The construction broke the seal. I have to project down, into the bedrock. I have to be the mortar." Another tremor hit, violent enough to knock them both into the doorframe. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of snapping roots and shifting stone. "I can't do it alone," she confessed, the vulnerability in her amber eyes piercing his fear. "When I go under, my body is empty, vulnerable. If the roof collapses while I'm in the trance, I die. If I lose my tether to the surface, I drift forever." Julian looked down at her. He saw the woman he had loved at 17, and the enigma who terrified him at 46. He looked at the chaos around them, the impossible reality of her power and the terrifying fragility of her human form. "What do you need?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave. The skepticism was gone, incinerated by necessity. "An anchor," Alara whispered. "Someone of the earth. Someone with iron in their blood and stone in their soul. I need you to hold me, Julian. Don't let me go. No matter what you see, no matter how cold I get, do not let go." He didn't hesitate. He pulled her down to the floor, amidst the glass and the dust, putting his back against the strongest load-bearing stud in the room. He spread his legs and settled her between them, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "I have you," he murmured against her ear, inhaling the scent of crushed sage and rain that clung to her hair. "I'm here. I'm the foundation." Alara closed her eyes. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, her hands resting on his forearms. "Do not let the mountain take me." She exhaled, a long, rattling breath, and then she was gone. Julian felt the change instantly. Her body went heavy, an inanimate weight in his arms. The warmth drained from her skin so fast it burned him, leaving her cold as marble. For a terrifying second, he thought she had died. "Ilara," he whispered, tightening his grip until the fabric of his suit strained. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, seeking a pulse. Then the room vanished. Or it seemed to. The air filled with a hum that vibrated in his teeth. The floorboards beneath them rippled. Julian squeezed his eyes shut. He visualized the blueprints of this house. He visualized the steel beams of his skyscrapers in Chicago. He visualized the concrete pilings he had driven into riverbeds. He poured every ounce of his stubborn, rational architectural will into the woman in his arms. "I am the stone," he thought fiercely. "I am the wall. You are safe." Below them, deep in the dark earth, Ilara felt him. She was a ribbon of light weaving through the chaotic, screaming mud, stitching the fissures of the bedrock back together with pure will. The darkness tried to swallow her, the ancient rage of the forest seeking to consume her magic. But there was a tether, a silver cord of unyielding steel pulling tight around her waist. Julian. He was the only thing real in a world of shadow. Above, the cottage shook violently one last time. A chunk of plaster fell, striking Julian's shoulder, but he didn't flinch. He didn't move. He held her cold form with a desperation that defied all logic. He kissed the side of her head, murmuring her name like a prayer, like an incantation of his own making. Slowly, agonizingly, the roaring ceased. The ground settled with a heavy, final thud. The dust began to drift, no longer agitated. The silence that followed was thick and absolute. Julian didn't loosen his grip. He waited, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. A gasp tore through the room. Ilara's body jerked, heat flooding back into her veins so quickly she cried out. She slumped forward, coughing, her hands scrabbling at his arms. "I've got you," Julian choked out, turning her in his arms so he could see her face. "I've got you, Ilara." She looked up at him, her eyes swimming with tears, the amber light soft and dim. She reached up, her dirty, trembling fingers tracing the lines of worry etched into his face. "You stayed. Where else would I go?" He brushed a curl of dark hair from her forehead, his thumb lingering on her temple. He looked at her, really looked at her. The monster was gone. The witch was gone. There was only Ilara. "The hotel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The plans." "Burn them," Julian said, his voice rough. He pulled her forehead against his, closing his eyes, surrendering to the impossible truth of her. "I can't build on a graveyard, Ilara, and I won't build on your soul." She let out a sob that was half laugh, collapsing against him. Julian held her there, in the ruin of the cottage, amidst the wreckage of his skepticism, knowing that for the first time in his life, he had built something that would actually last. 4 years later, the autumn air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and dried apples. Julian walked out onto the cantilever deck, 2 mugs of coffee in his hands. He paused for a moment, admiring the view, not just the sweep of the valley, but the structure itself. It wasn't a hotel, it was a sanctuary. The house didn't dominate the forest, it breathed with it. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls curved around the ancient oaks rather than cutting through them. The main support beam of the living room was a living cedar tree, encased in glass and steel, continuing up through the roof to the canopy above. It was a masterpiece of organic architecture, a marriage of his discipline and her wildness. Ilara was standing at the railing, wrapped in a thick wool cardigan that swallowed her small frame. She was watching the moon rise, a sliver of pearl against the darkening violet sky. Julian moved up behind her, wrapping an arm around her waist. She didn't jump. She leaned back into him, a movement so practiced and natural it felt like breathing. "The North Ridge is settling nicely," Julian said quietly, handing her a mug. The retaining wall held through the rain. Ilara smiled against the rim of her cup. "I told you the roots would hold if you gave them room. And I told you that reinforced concrete doesn't hurt as a backup," he teased, pressing a kiss to the curve of her neck. He felt the hum of her magic, a low, pleasant vibration that no longer startled him. It just felt like home. She turned in his arms, her amber eyes catching the moonlight. She looked older, lines of laughter and wisdom deepening around her eyes, but she had never looked more beautiful. "You saved this place, Julian. You saved us." "No," he corrected gently, resting his forehead against hers, his slate eyes locking with her amber ones. "I just built the walls, Ilara. You are the magic that keeps them standing." She reached up, her hand resting over his heart, sensing the steady, rhythmic beat beneath the silk of his shirt. "Do you ever miss it? The city? The logic?" Julian looked past her, into the dark, whispering woods where shadows moved with a life of their own. He tightened his hold on her, feeling the impossible heat of her skin, the woman who had taught him that the world was far wider, darker, and more beautiful than a set of blueprints could ever capture. "My love," he whispered, his voice thick with a devotion that transcended time. "I have never been more awake." As the moon cleared the tree line, bathing them in silver, the shadows in the forest seemed to bow, and for a moment, just a moment, the wind carried a whisper that sounded like his name.